Hi, my name is Tucker Jennings, and welcome to the Spin Cycle. This is a multi-part series on the history of propaganda, and more specifically the history of media and the creation and distribution of propaganda over time. Through a series of interviews with experts on propaganda, media history, and historical periods, we're going to discover the history of media's role in propaganda by looking at some of the most notable periods of change in the landscape of media and communication, and how they affected the politics of their respective eras. Architecture, books, newspapers, radio, film, TV, perhaps even the device you're using to listen to this podcast right now. The things that we humans have used to communicate social and political power and the periods where they made a big splash. That's what we're going to be looking at in this podcast. Speaking of the device you're using to listen to this podcast, I'd say it's fairly representative of the most recent era of change when it comes to media and propaganda. And speaking of making a big splash, I think it's fair to say that we might be in uncharted waters here, right? It's a weird time. This is the age of digital media, social media. More people than ever before have a device on their person at all times that allows them to consume propaganda at a whole new level. But that device is not just a way of consuming propaganda. As we've seen over the past decade or so, that device allows the average Joe to directly participate in the creation and circulation of propaganda in a way and on a level that is untested in human history. Or is it? Hopefully through this podcast and through these conversations about history, we can discover whether or not the age of digital media and social media is a unique development in the history of propaganda, or if it's just another step in the historical cycle of political spin. What you're about to hear is episode 1 of the Spin Cycle. Since this is our introductory episode, I wanted to explore propaganda more generally, really as an idea. My guest today is Professor Nicholas J. Cull. He is a professor of public diplomacy at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Southern California. He's authored books such as Reputational Security, The Cold War in United States Information Agency, American Propaganda and Public Diplomacy, and Selling War, the British propaganda campaign against American neutrality in World War II. I hope you find this conversation as fascinating as I did. Without further ado, Professor Nicholas Cull. All right, so as the podcast is sort of about the history of propaganda, I really wanted to start with, just in layman's terms, what is propaganda?
Well, that's a really good question, because propaganda exists at two levels, really. You have the common word propaganda thrown around in regular people's speech, which kind of means political rhetoric or even lies that I disagree with, and is thrown around as a sort of political swear word. And the other use of it is as a technical term to mean mass political persuasion. And I say mass political persuasion because I think we have a separate activity called advertising, which is mass commercial persuasion, and those two have to be teased apart, though the tools you use for studying one also apply to the other, and there's always a little bit of overlap. But part of the problem with studying propaganda is you have to keep a sort of a separation between the idea that propaganda is just a tool and the feeling that people have that propaganda is a value charged activity. So one way I talk about the common understanding of propaganda is to say that propaganda is to communication as murder is to killing. That propaganda is understood to be the morally negative form of communication. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this myself. When I started studying propaganda, I believed that propaganda was neutral, that it was, there's a line in a Western about guns being no better, no worse than the man who's using them. And I thought propaganda was like that. I have now come to the conclusion that propaganda is a bad idea because of its cost. And the cost of propaganda is paid in truth. Anytime you distort in the universe of communication, in the universe of human knowledge, you establish some kind of debt, and that debt has to be paid. Someone has to pick up the tab. That little bit of advantage you get from distorting reality in your favor. And it might be, think of it as, the interpersonal kind of propaganda where you go out in the evening and tell, the lady or gentleman you're interested in that you're a surgeon. At some point, she's going to realize you're not a surgeon. At the nation state level, you go out and tell other countries that you're terrific, that you're driven by great moral principles. She's going to find out you're not a surgeon. They're going to find out that you're a regular country that makes mistakes. And the further you go in the distortion, the bigger the price. And the problem is you never know who's going to pay the price. And there are some really notorious historical cases where a campaign worked super well in one generation, and then there was a terrible price to pay in a later generation. The best known case is the way in which it was possible to mobilize world opinion against Germany during World War One by saying that the Germans were doing terrible things, which certainly they were, but new terrible things were added and exaggerated. And then, 20 years after that, when Germany really was doing historically unprecedented terrible things, people didn't believe it, or they diluted it, or they took it with a pinch of salt. And the price of that was paid by the victims of the Holocaust, whose peril and then whose tragedy was not understood in its own time. And that's a terrible thing. So my feeling is that we have to be really careful with propaganda because of the unintended consequence, because of the dangers of somebody having to pay for a distortion that we don't understand, and that it's much better to work with education and a slow, careful approach to understanding that won't have a buyer's remorse. But of course, that's in an ideal world, and the reality is people use propaganda, and even in the best cause, we have a kind of a remorse and questioning and a sense that we might have been sold a bill of goods. And so right now you can see how there's a sort of a backlash against Ukraine, thinking, oh, did we go too far in our support for Ukraine?
Yeah, you sort of dipped your toe into my next question, which is propaganda uniformly bad? Or if I could play devil's advocate a bit, are there positive elements to it as well?
Well, I think that the positive aspect is the immediate benefit that comes from propaganda. The danger is where it takes you. And I think it's really I've spent my professional life studying propaganda, and sometimes you don't even know the price. So, for example, Winston Churchill did an amazing job building up Britain as being the special country that deserved the world's aid, and that probably saved Britain in 1940. The problem is, the 40, 50 years later, when people in Britain who learned about that campaign actually became so attached to the idea that they didn't think that Britain should collaborate within the European Union, that Britain became, too special to be a team member, and we get that kind of Brexit mentality, which is also, to be honest, that's part of what Britain is. But I think it was nurtured by the memories. Not of memories of war, but the memories of war. So it's slightly more potent because it isn't actually based on the feeling of people who were really there, who were completely interested in a European Union after the war, but on how do we understand the feeling that we get from this historic experience. So my generation was a Brexit generation, I think in part because of experience and our attachment to stories that were promoted during the war. So, and I could do the same analysis of pretty much any propaganda campaign I've studied. I've worked a lot on propaganda against apartheid in South Africa. that has also had a kind of a unintended consequence of disappointment with post apartheid South Africa. Everything has its has its sort of repositioning, its swinging back, its rebalancing after the fact. But propaganda as itself is a really interesting term, because it was a term that was invented not by the state but by the church. So the term propaganda was rediscovered by this churchman, Ignatius Loyola, in 1539, because he wanted to have a word to describe the process of explaining the Catholic faith, not to people who didn't believe, but to people who were going to become specialists to promote the faith in new parts of the world. So in what's now Latin America, in Asia, if he was going to send people out to convert people, to push back against the Protestant faith in Europe, he felt that there had to be a systematic way of communicating the faith. And he proposed, or he revived, this Roman term, this Latin term, propaganda, meaning to propagate, but to propagate an idea. I've only ever found it in Latin meaning spreading an idea, even though it comes from the vocabulary of propagating a little plant. It was always used by the Romans to mean spreading an idea as if it were a little plant. Is that none of the Roman agriculture manuals we have talk about propaganda to spread your fig trees or something. It's always about promoting a religious idea. So Ignatius comes up with this idea of a systematic communication, if you like, giving many ideas to one person, one religious specialist. And then the Catholic Church run with this. It becomes part of the foundation of the Jesuit order. And then they begin to create a bureaucracy for propaganda. And 100 years, well, 90 years after Ignatius was writing, the term becomes actual building within Rome. The Sacred Congregation of the Propagation of the Faith, or Propaganda Fide, is a palace in Rome where a whole ministry of the Vatican is located. But what this means, and where the story's going, is that anybody who doesn't like the Catholic Church immediately doesn't like the term propaganda, doesn't like the term censorship, doesn't like the term Inquisition, and all of these bits of jargon that the Church had developed because of the situation it found itself in with the Reformation become absolute trigger words for Northern Europeans. So from pretty much the get-go of propaganda coming into the general vocabulary of Northern Europe, it's a trigger, bad word, and that kind of dogs the term right through the 19th century. Americans are a little more open-minded about it, and then World War One, I think, spoils the word for Americans.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I did not know any of that about Loyola. I guess that kind of segues us into talking a bit more about the history of propaganda as the idea, or as we know it now. Even though we might not have, called it propaganda throughout history, there's still this idea that wherever people organize politically and socially, there's always been a communication of power, I would assume. So
sure, absolutely. No, the way I say it, Tucker, is that propaganda is not a moment in political history. It's a dimension of political history, because I get kind of frustrated that there are moments in history where people suddenly notice propaganda, and usually it's when a new medium comes along. So when printing came along, people said, "Oh my God, what are we going to do now that ideas can be spread by the printing press?" And when radio came along, there was a propaganda panic. "Oh my God, we'll be hearing voices on the radio, and then we'll be like little remote control people." And the same thing has happened with the internet and with social media. We're in the middle of a massive propaganda panic, and I think rightly so, because people are much more malleable when there is a new medium of communication on the horizon. I presume there was some panic in medieval times when ballads got going and minstrels started saying how terrible the French were. This is going to be a problem for any society, and rightly so. But talking about our medium, talking about our media, and talking about how people react to political ideas, this is part of the cure. You see, because if we talk about it, we start to develop, you can think of it as antibodies or immunities or resistance to how political ideas are communicated to us. Think of it as being media-specific skepticism. So like when you're growing up and your mum says, no, you can't believe everything you read in the papers, right? That was a developed folk response to media exposure that had been... because, of course, at some point, people believed that you could believe everything you read in the papers, right? But the public learned differently. Now we're starting to understand that you can't believe everything online. You can't believe every TikTok. You can't. You shouldn't read the comments. All of these sorts of things are part of our evolving wisdom around use of social media for propaganda.
Yeah, so that really moves us into my other question, which is, what are some of those high watermark moments of propaganda where people notice it, where it becomes very obvious, and have those moments tended to align with revolutions in media technology?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what I would say is that if you have a new medium and an economic crisis coming together, you are in a very dangerous situation, because any international crisis becomes tremendously more volatile. And the problem is that as analysts in our memory and so forth, when we think about the crises of the past, we remember the personalities and we remember the countries involved, but we don't remember the media that helped public opinion to boil over. So we call World War I the Kaiser's War, or, that war started by Germany. We don't call it the war made worse or made insoluble by mass circulation newspapers. And yet you can't understand the origins of World War I without looking at how newspapers sold themselves to their respective populations by demonizing their immediate neighbors, and got into a mindset where the death of some Austrian archduke 1,000 miles away would become a trigger to the collapse of a European security system. Similarly, you can't understand World War II's origins without looking at the way in which particular publics would move into impossible and irreconcilable positions based on being susceptible to their own government's propaganda. So Goebbels himself said there could be no victory of National Socialism without the radio and without the ability to fly around Germany in aeroplanes. So I think we have to take Goebbels at his word and see, World War II as a war built by media and people's susceptibility to propaganda. And the Cold War would have been more soluble were it not for new mechanisms of communication stirring up local publics, including the United States, where McCarthyism became a lot worse because of McCarthy's ability to use the new medium of television. You can also see how that's part of the domestic mindset around the Vietnam War, is also to do with what Americans are seeing on TV. So I think that we have given our media of communication too little role in understanding our global crises, and we've given the great men too much of a role. And I think that's very dangerous, because what we have right now is a situation globally that's frighteningly similar not so much the outbreak of World War II, but it really reminds me of the run up to World War One. I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, going off of what you were saying about great men, I found in my research for this podcast that it's a bit hard for the average consumer, the average person like me who's interested in stuff like this, to find out more about media's role in the politics of ancient times through kind of the pre-modern era, because it seems like there's such a focus on the great man theory and that way of looking at things.
Well, I would see it in terms of the cultural enhancements of power, the ways in which somebody using power is able to take stories or rituals to and use them as multipliers. So you can look at Alexander the Great and the way in which he wasn't just a physical force, but he leveraged a cultural force too. So the standard portrait of Alexander the Great shows him with hair like a lion, chin up, looking to the horizon. So he's a man, but he has the hair of a beast and the pose, the chin up, of a god looking beyond the horizon. So if you go up against Alexander, you're not just going up against a person who has a reputation as a successful leader, you're going up against a person who has cultural leverage of power and divine power. So that's a much scarier, much more intimidating thing to encounter. And the image of Alexander, I think, then becomes a standard thing in the depiction of leadership within the Mediterranean world. And the Romans just take this on board, take it to the next level. And, we're still using Julius Caesar's family name, to mean an emperor, for goodness sake. This is an amazing sort of cultural appropriation. And, the name of a particular hill, Palatine, becomes the source of the word palace. So we're living in the wake of ancient Rome. I think that stories, including religious stories, were used to enhance power. Also, cultural forms like music became part of building up the inevitability of someone's victory on the battlefield, and certainly made conditioned the minds of people involved towards their success or their defeat. And maybe that's where we see modern communications being prefigured. You can also see that in Greece there was not only an understanding that rhetoric enhanced power, but a real mistrust of anybody who could really master rhetoric. Remember, Socrates was not necessarily a welcome figure in Greek society, and in the end, they forced him to commit suicide. So, I in that regard, you see an ongoing struggle against the power of propaganda, and an understanding that this is one of the this is a kind of a glitch in human understanding, that humans are great with reason, but every now and again we are completely pulled off and do crazy stuff because of irrational power of persuaded to the irrational by somebody else's eloquence.
Yeah, which I think brings us to my final question. The point of this podcast series is to dive into those potential high watermark moments of media and propaganda that we were talking about as sort of a way to historically segue ourselves into the big question, which is, are we in one of those moments right now, especially with digital media, social media? And while there has always been the democratization of media, it seems we're sort of in an era where there's not just a democratization of media consumption, but of media creation and how that affects things differently.
Absolutely. No, I think that's very important. But I think before you go any further, that it's really important that I disrupt the dominant understanding of propaganda. And to me, one of the reasons that Americans specifically are susceptible to propaganda is because they like to imagine it as an idea that begins in the mind of a bad person. So they have this model that out there are some really bad people or people who have a lust for power, and they come up with an idea, and then they transmit that idea through media to kind of innocent people who are living in a happy little Smurf village, right, and completely untroubled. But then an idea comes along and they believe the idea, and before you know it, these happy little Smurfs have formed into battalions that are going off to slaughter their neighbors. Now, I think that's wrong, because I think it misunderstands the location of the bad idea. And the true propagandist doesn't take an idea from his head and put it in your head. He takes an idea that is already in your head and speaks it in public and connects his political agenda to what you already believe. So what you hear in your head is a great big yes, yes, that's right. So Adolf Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism. He rode the anti-Semitism, harnessed the anti-Semitism that already existed and took it to a new level. And similarly, our leaders today didn't invent the idea that Britain should leave Europe, or that the US should take control of its immigration, or any of these other ideas that are out there right now, that migrants are bad people. The leaders rather articulated something that people already thought, recognized and articulated something that had been repressed in other fora. And that was a tremendously powerful thing to do. But to move towards a conclusion on a positive note, just as people have always thought, I have suffered. No people have suffered like my people. We need to get a better deal. We're special. Right? And you can ride that feeling to political mischief. People have also all thought, we are all the same. We're all born. We all die. We all go through suffering. We are capable of empathy with each other. And I think that just as you can connect to the bad thoughts that people have, you can connect to the good thoughts that people have too. And there is great hope in human communication in connecting to the better natures, as I would see it, the better nature that people have, and the idea of having one world, of having a shared destiny, and of understanding that the problems of this planet are too big for any one leader to solve, that we have to sit down and talk about our problems and work out ways of being better, not individually, but together. So, that's where I would park this discussion.
Thank you so much. I couldn't ask for a better ending to the episode, so thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure and an honor, so thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.